everyone. Okay, so now for something completely different. So I'm not specifically a UI UX person, which is probably the quickest way to lose my audience. Well done. But I am Chief Creative Officer and co-founder at Spirit AI, which is a company which makes tools and middleware to help devs make games more accessible and more expressive in various different ways. So we do things like make a tool for creating dynamic, responsive, naturalistic characters, also another tool for sort of detecting and intervening in online harassment and sort of, and rewarding good behavior. So kind of a lot of overlap with some of the stuff that was talked about yesterday in the toxicity sessions. And I'm also someone who makes indie games. So I'm a game designer and programmer. I'm also a professor of game design at the New York University Game Center. And in addition to that, I also, so my doctorate was in immersive interfaces and sort of what they mean for how we relate to games. Broadly speaking, the work that I do kind of falls into, there's two broad axes, I suppose, and in no particular order. So firstly, I'm really interested in this idea of memetic or naturalistic interfaces. So experiences around, so we could call them immersive interfaces, we can call them embodied naturalism. I can think of another sort of 10 terms which would describe the same thing, which is kind of centered on the mapping between our own bodies and that of the characters that we're inhabiting. So kind of like physically role-playing a scenario as much as possible. So that concept can run the full gamut from a full room-scale VR experience in which your character is kind of exploring a 3D space. But it can also be something like the death from above scenario in Call of Duty 4, which replicates a sort of a bomber operator. So the sort of narrative justification for that is the same as the embodied experience of play. Or even something like Papers, Please, for example, where the experience of sort of the things that you do in the game, so things like reading, stamping, etc., they all match the things that are performed narratively as well, which leads to this kind of narrative or diegetic immersion. The second thing that I'm really interested in is what I think of as procedural character-based narratives. And really the idea of characters is something that I'll be talking about quite a lot today in particular. So what I'm interested in is, and what I work at various parts of actually, is this thing that I've defined as this kind of spectrum from autonomous NPC-driven stories at one end through to story-driven autonomous NPCs at the other end. So the first one, autonomous NPC-driven stories, are those which are kind of based around simulating the interactions of lots and lots of NPCs, autonomous NPCs, or agents, I suppose. And they can sort of tell us something about a particular world through having the player interrogate and interact with the social model that underpins those NPCs. So examples might be The Sims, or even Papers, Please again, with its procedurally generated characters. I also worked on a game a few years back now called Red Shirt, which was a kind of Facebook meets Star Trek simulator, which had this cast of hundreds of characters with different variations. And the way that stories are told to us in that kind of scenario is really through this sort of mechanism of noticing things, right? So we notice the ways in which different characters are set up in opposition to each other. We notice how something is different or behaving differently from something else. So the mechanisms, the mechanics of noticing is how the storytelling happens in this particular kind of scenario. On the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum that I kind of made up is what I'd call story-driven autonomous NPCs. So those are NPCs which have been sort of crafted to know a lot about a particular story space. The way that you learn about that story space is by kind of interrogating and interacting with that particular character on a much deeper level through some kind of dialogue or even some other set of interactions which act upon that NPC. So those are the sort of two areas that I'm really interested in from a sort of practice point of view. So I'm going to talk about those, and so the naturalistic interfaces, naturalistic characters, how they intersect with each other in some of the work that I do, but then also how all of that informs a third major area of interest for me, which is inclusivity in games. So there are a number of ways that I try to do advocacy in that area. So I'm on the advisory board for the advocacy track at GDC. I've previously been a STEM ambassador in the UK, countless other things, as well as obviously operating as a woman of color in this space. Okay, now being frank here for a second, the concern I always have with doing talks like this, and being someone who looks like me doing talks like this, and from my background, is worrying that people will stop paying attention because it's like, oh, it's another sort of diversity or inclusivity talk. My favorite one, when people assume that my interest in this comes from having some kind of agenda and games are somehow my disingenuous means to achieve that agenda rather than like the other way around. But anyway, so that is not true. After all of us here, I assume, are people who love games. The form of games, at least, if not always the culture around games. And so the goal should be that we want more people to be as passionate about that as we are, right? And of course, there have been countless other talks as well which have argued for the sort of economic argument for caring about making games with more diverse appeal. So hopefully those are arguments that we can skip for today, because I want to talk about a particular vision of how we can kind of orient the future of games to be more inclusive in general. Now, all that aside, I do want to just take a very quick second to talk about the difference between diversity and inclusivity, because I think that what we should be aiming for is not just more kinds of voices, but also the opportunity to actually bring those voices into the fold, right? And actually do something meaningful with diversity. Because what is the point of trying to attract diverse voices and perspectives if you're not going to include them? So diversity can't exist without inclusivity. And inclusivity, thankfully, is something that we can tackle through design. Obviously, asterisk, asterisk, because obviously it's not that simple. It's not like, let's just solve the world through design. There's a lot of other complicated factors at play, as I'm sure we've noticed in the news and such. But this is at least something that we can do. And I want to be clear as well. We've had some great talks on accessibility today, and of course this is kind of related to all of that, but I want to focus on two much more specific questions here, which are, number one, how do we include, represent, and make room for different experiences of the world? And secondly, how do we foster more positive, anti-bigoted attitudes in players with automatic biases towards others, right? In other words, how do we act against some of those often unintentional biases, right? And we talked a little bit about cognitive biases that people have yesterday. How do we act against those sort of sometimes unintentional biases that people end up with just due to sometimes the lack of exposure to minority groups, for example? There were some really great talks, obviously, yesterday on toxicity, and I loved the emphasis that some of the speakers placed on kind of re-educating people, right, and sort of rehabilitating people, rather than just punishing, per se. So how do we actually foster more positive attitudes in players and sort of help work against some of those sort of automatic biases which might have come about just due to cultural factors in sort of who they've been exposed to? And you'll notice that questions 1 and 2 are actually about addressing two very different audiences. So who here has heard of the implicit association test? A good number of you have, okay. So it's a test which was devised, it came out of MIT a while ago, I don't remember the dates, but it's a test with a set of rapid fire associations that you make with each statement. And then what it does is it kind of evaluates the biases that you have in terms of race, gender, etc. And because you're making these very, very quick associations. So file that one away, because we'll come back to that later. But how do we do all that through UX design, right? So again, as someone who isn't specifically a UX designer, but a generalist game designer instead, with a specific interest in these kind of simulationist, character-driven games, I kind of asked myself how I define or think about UX myself. Because when we're thinking about UX, we're kind of thinking about how possible interactions are actually communicated. Like, how do we actually tell players what is possible? How do we help them expect what is possible? And how do we justify to them what is possible? And as we sort of talked about in various flavors over the last couple of days, one way to do that is to, of course, leverage their existing mental model of the world. In its most basic form, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because it's something that I'm sure, and something we're all familiar with. We talked about it a bit. The folks who did the Forza talk yesterday mentioned that driving is kind of one of the most relatable things that you can do in a game, because a lot of us know how to drive, and so the way that a vehicle handles, et cetera, is something that we can sort of just, you can use our existing mental models for. So we bring those ideas of how vehicles handle into games, and that informs what we think is even possible to do. So if you successfully support those mental models, that's how you can provide people with this sense of agency, right? Specifically, the definition of agency that I really like is one that was proposed by Noah Wardrip-Fruin, Mike Matthias, and Stephen Dow in their paper from DIGRA 2009, which kind of got rid of this idea of agency as being this kind of free will, where you can sort of do anything, go anywhere, et cetera, and instead was about, okay, what happens when the actions that players kind of want to do are supported by an underlying computational model? And indeed, how does that underlying computational model also then inform the things that players want to do? And our job as game designers, specifically when talking about UX, is to communicate that underlying computational model. And speaking of a player's mental model versus underlying computational models, there's a couple of separate but related points that I want to address when it comes to how we use and represent characters. I did warn you this was kind of my general area of interest. And I think that this is important because overall, one thing that we all have some idea of as people who exist in the world is some idea of how the social world works, right? Obviously, not everyone's ideas of it are the same or necessarily as well thought out as others, but nevertheless, we all have some idea of what it is to interact with other people, right? We're innately social creatures that way. And yet, this is precisely an area where there's this big disconnect between a player's mental model versus the underlying computational model often in games. I'd argue that actually one of the biggest underserved areas in games is the way that we model characters and then also represent those models. So even when we think of some of our favorite characters, and often if you ask people, they'll name some BioWare character, right? No matter how well written the dialogue might be, or what the story arc might be, there's often these constraints in how much we can kind of express ourselves to characters, but also how our overall interactions with them play out. The thing is, our interaction with characters seems to generally be very transactional, right? We've heard of, I'm sure some of you have heard of the sort of kindness coins analogy, right? When it comes to romance in games, put kindness coins in, sex falls out, right? So on that note, I don't think we can talk about using players' existing mental models without also talking about how games can inform and update our mental models as well. So that's especially important when it comes to characters and representing people. I like to make it a point to expose underlying models of characters as far as possible. And one way of doing that is through the process of character creation. So this was the character creation screen on Redshirt, the Star Trek on a Facebook on Star Trek simulation game that I mentioned, because the way that we design the underlying computational model of a character and then expose that back to the player are really important. Character creation screens kind of say a lot about, and I'd argue in turn inform, how we categorize people and what we think of as being default. In Redshirt, gender was a float rather than a bool or anything else, so, which isn't a perfect system at all, but hopefully it's a step, right? So it was represented as this slider. Also things like pansexuality was kind of default, right? So it's like interested in all, ticked by default. And so that's one part of the UX puzzle when it comes to inclusivity. If your game features a character creation process, and I'd argue that it should, whether it's to sort of create the player character and inform sort of, how people are represented in your game, or even just to set the starting parameters for a couple of NPCs, this character creation process communicates that underlying computational model. So this not only dictates at a representational level who feels included or not, right? So that's the other thing. So, often players will see themselves in these processes and feel much more welcome to the game, but it also says something to others as well about how we should think about people. But again, I really do think that one key part of the future of inclusivity in games lays with how we use characters in general, right? Stimulated people who are truly dynamic and responsive to take advantage of the fact that, again, human interaction is a system that most people are familiar with. There are sort of fewer new literacies we have to introduce. We're already in this era where some of this is starting outside of games, right? We're getting increasingly used to digital assistants, right? So Siri, Alexa, and so on. And the goal there is to reduce the friction of getting tasks done, right? So I'll use Siri sometimes to just add a calendar appointment, et cetera. So we can see how there's this kind of turn towards the personified or the sort of slightly more character-based. And while we're talking about these sort of, non-fictional sort of applications of this outside of games, that is in part informed by some other problematic ideals, and that's a whole other topic you can talk to me about later. It's still very transactional, right? However, I'd say that inside of fictional settings, there's a whole lot of fascinating potential for bringing people into the fold, who perhaps don't have the existing literacies for interacting with these kinds of things otherwise. So you might, for instance, have seen the press around the Star Wars hotels at Disneyland, which features some characters you can interact with and kind of, show you around the space, et cetera. Totally planning on just living there. When that opens. And going back to games again, there is some precedent there for games involving characters to bring in a much more inclusive, diverse audience. One example is Crusader Kings 2. There was a talk at GDC a few years back that the devs did, that Paradox did, where they said that they noticed there's a lot more women playing Crusader Kings 2 than their previous strategies titles, which is really awesome, right? And they specifically had built the game around the idea of people, not countries. And they said something like the story of a nation can never be as compelling or engaging on a personal level as that of characters. But of course, Crusader Kings 2 is a game which works via those mechanics of noticing, like I mentioned, where the underlying computational model is one that you can glean via noticing how these different characters, and there's a lot of characters who are generated, how they're all different from each other. And you sort of choose who to pay attention to and what you pay attention to about them. And that's how, as a player, you build up this idea of the possibility of characters, and you build up that mental model of them. But I want to talk about this side of the spectrum again, because this is really where I see a large part of the future of inclusivity going. Again, leveraging people's mental models for character interaction. And we're seeing the idea of naturalistic interactions through modalities like natural language, speech, gestures, et cetera, start to emerge, but also achieving, so one of the things we're tackling at Spirit is kind of achieving that in a way that can also still tell a story or have an agenda that the character is trying to accomplish. So one of the things that we're doing at Spirit is developing this thing called Character Engine, which is the idea that developers and writers can author these characters who respond dynamically and naturalistically to things that a player says. They can do things like, so whether that's in a fully fledged VR environment, responding to gestures and position and natural language, or in a more traditional game with dialogue options which are generated on the fly. So characters can sort of have a memory of where a conversation's gone before, things that you've talked about with them as a player. And also, they know what they want to say to you next based on the sort of narrative possibility space, and can draw dynamically from those. They can decide exactly how to phrase things according to what their current emotional state is, and so on and so on. So if they're angry, maybe they'll be more curt, or if they're nervous, maybe they'll add disfluencies, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is that characters which are more deeply expressive and naturalistic, meaning that they can say things about the narrative space in which they live, can sort of really help bring in players who wouldn't otherwise, who are otherwise turned off by how transactional character interactions can often be in games. So the hope is really to make it possible for developers to build these very responsive, yet still very robust characters for all kinds of contexts, from single-player experiences to MMOs to VR and AR, to characters who are there to help you learn how to even play a game, so kind of tutorialized characters. And again, games based on characters who can respond in these sort of very responsive, naturalistic, and representationally diverse, have characters who are very representationally diverse, can sort of move away from that very transactional model, where so the conversation you're having with the character itself is kind of more exploratory and satisfying to just have that conversation. So I'm hoping that that's one of the ways that we can answer both parts of the challenge that I defined earlier. So making room for all kinds of experiences of the world, but also fostering more positive attitudes in those with biases. But the other thing I wanted to point to as well, so in our work with sort of, really foregrounding characters, when it comes to sort of the idea of inclusivity, is the other side of the work that we're doing for detection and intervention in sort of player communities. Very much along the lines of the excellent work that Ruth and her team have been doing at Twitch. But then also, when the other thing that we do involving characters is when we've figured out that a player is engaging in these very toxic behaviors or language, whether it's just to sort of one person or to many people, for example, in an MMO, we can deploy this. Actually, is this going to play? This is a super old video that we made about a year ago now, but it kind of represents how the system can work, where you have like a character who can step in, like powered by character engine. You can have an NPC who already lives in this MMO world, and they can sort of come in and mediate a situation between two players, or re-educate, or send a private message to one or both parties, either soothing or reinforcing, what happened. So the idea is kind of like automated GMs, right? Only sort of narratively involved in the game in some way. I love the example that one of the speakers pointed out yesterday of players feeling really good about reporting toxicity when they were thanked by a sort of police-like character. And so this kind of operates on the same principle, but with a character that's also sort of more naturalistic, right, and interactive. So I was going to sort of touch a little bit on, since there's been sort of VR and AR discussion today, I wanted to bring up my other angle of work in sort of memetic interfaces. Because again, this feeds into the idea of sort of naturalistic interaction for inclusivity. So I won't go into the sort of ins and outs of my doctoral work, but this is a screenshot from a study I did where I was looking at how people related to a character in a sort of very morally significant scenario, where they were sort of rock climbing with this NPC. You can see the sort of players floating hands, and they sort of like rock climb through using a memetic interface. And so people played it in VR and non-VR contexts. One of the things that I found is that in VR, as you would kind of expect, people related more to what was going on in the scene and felt closer to the character, etc., and felt worse about what they had to do. So, well, spoilers, but well, not really spoilers, but once they sort of had been climbing together for a bit, and the characters kind of talking to them, talking to them one way, the sort of the rope breaks, and it's the usual, two people hanging from one rope, it's not going to support everyone's weight, and so the NPC is kind of screaming at you to sacrifice her and save yourself, etc. So I was basically trying to figure out, what a player's going to do in that scenario. The interesting thing was, so in the VR, in the sort of more memetic VR scenario, people took longer to decide what to do, they felt worse. If they already had a pre-existing level of sort of trait empathy, they felt worse about having to cut the rope, or they just didn't do it at all. One of the interesting things, though, was I also looked at the difference between people who played a lot of games and didn't play a lot of games. And people who, it was really people who didn't play a lot of games who felt worse, right? Felt guiltier, more upset, more attached to the character, which in some ways kind of makes sense, because I think, this going back to the idea of very transactional interactions with NPCs in games. Usually, sort of players, people who play a lot of games have this sort of set of expectations about consequence to do with NPCs, right, or lack thereof. Players who don't, people who didn't really play a lot of games expected the character to be more real. And so they also found it more jarring, though, when the character didn't respond in ways that they'd expect. So, they expected to be able to speak to the character and things like that. Their mental model of the character's naturalism was disrupted because it wasn't supported by the underlying computational model. So all that is to say that I think that the future of characters in AR and VR is definitely more conversational, right? Again, just getting as close to that idea of naturalistic interaction as possible. So the other thing that was really interesting about the study was that despite the differences in whether or not people chose to cut the rope in the different scenarios, and despite how upset some of them were, and people were like really, really crying in some instances, even those people would snap back when they were interviewed afterwards to oh, it's just a game type justification, which actually is really powerful, because ultimately it points to the double consciousness of play. It confirms that even when we're in this sort of VR environment, there's still a part of ourselves which acknowledges that. It's the sort of willing suspension of disbelief. So I like this quote from Kendall Walton, which says, "Fictional worlds can seem to us almost as real as the real world, even though we know perfectly well they're not." And I think that even when we're immersed, it's kind of that we're role-playing that we're immersed, right? We want to keep up that pretense because it's more compelling, more fun even to do so. It's just like how part of the compellingness of watching a really sad movie, for instance, is knowing that it's a really sad movie and that it's not real. So I think that when we're thinking about designing, sort of telling different stories involving characters in VR or using more sort of naturalistic or immersive interfaces, we shouldn't necessarily be striving to reality either. We should try to maintain that double consciousness of play and sort of use that. So I actually don't think that we talk enough in video games about the fact that we are willingly role-playing, right? Because I think we kind of assume that the power of computation has kind of taken away our need to do that we're kind of whisked away to this other reality without our consent. But really what we're doing is role-playing, and role-playing can be really powerful. If we frame it in that way, I believe that we can also design more inclusive VR experiences. So this is purely anecdotal, but I remember the first time I played a demo for the PSVR experience, the London Heist, and I found it really jarring, actually, because I don't know how many of you have played it, but it throws you into this kind of car chase scenario, and so I'm 5'3", and I know how tall I feel when I sit inside a car, and how tall I am compared to most people I sit next to in a car. And yet, in that game, I was just towering, I was just thrown into this car, and I was towering above this other character who looked like they were a big guy. And I just found it really distracting, and I kept thinking that some basic narrative framing of, oh, this is what your character looks like, this is who you're playing, would have been really helpful kind of going in, again, to sort of adjust my mental model. So So very quickly, just related to that, so there's been a lot of writing the past few years on the idea of VR for empathy and for critical intervention. And a lot of those have kind of focused, like so this is the infamous machine to be another, which is all about inhabiting the body of someone else. So you put on the headset and you sort of swap bodies with them. And interestingly, it's been shown that those experiences do reduce implicit bias, so using the implicit association test. And there was a study, I think this was in London at Royal Holloway a few years ago, where they did it before and after exposure to this scenario. And so it was like, yay, this reduces implicit bias, that's great. However, longitudinal follow-ups showed that the effect actually wears off again, right? So it's not lasting. The fact is, I don't think we can do much as passive observers. I don't think the answer is in just assuming that the viewer is someone who comes from that position of whatever kind of privilege it is and disrupting them by putting them into somebody else's shoes. It's in telling the stories instead of a wide variety of types of characters, by giving people exposure to those stories and giving them real agency within them. So I think that's one of the ways that we can represent and include lots of different experiences of the world, by doing better with how we model people and their interactions with each other instead of this purely transactional type of thing. I will say I don't think it's a coincidence per se that the core of Gamergate relied upon a game-like structure in which prominent women in the industry were thought of as dehumanized boss characters like NPCs, right? So I think that once, as an industry, we're more invested in how to properly represent characters and model characters, and as UX designers, how to properly expose their underlying computational models through things like character creators, responsive conversation, and more, we'll get to a place where we can better answer both of these challenges. That's it from me. Thank you very much.